Let's give them a big hand.
Woo. It's a shame I don't have my PowerPoint. It was truly remarkable. Would have blown you away. In 1924, the state of California sent an official request to the Secretary of Treasury for estimates on building an 8-foot high fence along their 160 miles international boundary with Mexico. Throughout the 1920s, Washington, D.C. was flooded with similar requests from cities and states all along the border. They asked for metal posts, walls, fences, gates, barbed wire. These requests have long been realized, and these material barriers comprise the collective image of most people when we contemplate the border today. However, in the 1920s, these requests had nothing to do with citizenship, or labor, or immigration. It was alcohol. Alcohol was building a wall between two nations. Now, when I say wall, I don't just mean a physical and material one built of concrete, wood, and metal. It is a cultural wall, an economic wall, and a legal wall. It is a wall of ideology, a wall of perception, a wall of separation. It is a wall between opportunity, between lives, between destinies. There was once a time when the border between the United States and Mexico was nothing more than a line on a map, nothing more than a line in the sand. In fact, at once, it did not exist at all. My research question asks how the American prohibition of alcohol during the 1920s and 30s transformed the relatively open border between the United States and Mexico into a highly secured and armed wall between the two nations. To investigate this question, I studied countless archival documents such as newspaper articles and governmental records. For today's talk, I will focus on how prohibition affected the perceptions of Mexican people in America from an advantageous and industrious group that contributed to American growth and prosperity, to an adverse and indigent group that America needed to expel by any means necessary. I will evaluate the once open and porous early 20th century border, its transformation during the 1920s and 30s as those crossing became entangled and demonized in the web of prohibition, and the legacy and impact of that transformation on what we know as the border today. Today, issues of labor, citizenship, and security are all constantly debated surrounding the border. But prior to the 1920s, the U.S.-Mexico border was a mainly open border that allowed Mexicans to cross north with little more than an $8 head tax. In fact, not only were Mexicans welcomed, they were recruited. They were seen as a hard-working people who were essential to the American economy. In the Southwest, their labor was the backbone of growing industries and developing boomtowns. For example, while most of America's agricultural industry declined and suffered from a lack of willing labor, southwestern states such as Texas and California grew to never-before prosperity, primarily on the backs of Mexican migrants. The Southwest became the leading sector in American agriculture and dominated the market for the first time in American history. Cities like El Paso experienced unprecedented growth as industry flocked to the border in order to take advantage of its unending pool of Mexican labor. A 1920s New York Times special feature sums it up best: the welcomed invasion. But prohibition changed everything. With the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, the sale, manufacture, distribution, and consumption of alcohol became illegal in America for the next 14 years. During that time, the border experienced a boom unlike any other before it. Prohibition in America was a conservative effort that had been building for decades. It was the culmination of a tireless movement of Americans determined to rid the country of alcohol and all its evils. But as we all know, prohibition was doomed to fail from its beginning. Overnight, a wave of crime rose up as America put one of its highest grossing industries in the hands of what the country now deemed criminals. In the North and in the East, organized crime took control of the now black market. And in the South, the border provided an endless flow of alcohol to quench America's insatiable thirst. As a map printed in Los Angeles Times in 1924 shows, outside of the eastern seaboard and the states surrounding Illinois, all of which were controlled by organized crime, Texas and California were the wettest states in the country, with California arguably being one of the most alcohol-saturated states in America. The border presented an obstacle to prohibition in two ways, in two directions. As Americans poured south to enjoy the unregulated freedom to drink in Mexico, illegal alcohol flowed north in an unrelenting wave. Mexican cities along the border benefited tremendously from vice tourism. Every night, Americans crossed the border into Mexico, and cities like Juarez and Tijuana became meccas for alcohol. Mexican businessmen, along with their American counterparts, invested heavily in bars, hotels, resorts, and casinos. Everyone from American laborers to the who's who of politicians and celebrities now made Mexico their #1 destination. Just as organized crime gangs grew to power in the East, powerful networks of smugglers reigned in the South. The limitless stream of profit alcohol-enabled created families, networks, and an illegal infrastructure that survives to this very day. Simply put, the Mexican border was making a mockery of American prohibition and those who stood behind it. Mexico was now perceived by many as a land of corruption and vice. Vice City, the Devil's Playground, these were popular nicknames for American cities by conservative Americans. This deviant Mexican border region began to symbolize Mexico as a whole. Regardless of their origin or connection to the border, this perception began to become attached to all Mexicans who came north. They were the same negative attitudes towards alcohol that led to its prohibition were now linked to Mexicans in general. It was during this time that the requests for walls were being sent to Washington. Border states saw this barrier as a way to keep Mexico's perceived corruption and immorality from spilling over into their own backyards. In 1924, the United States Border Patrol was officially created. While a border patrol had previously existed in various forms for decades, it wasn't until Prohibition that the government took a real and vested interest in it and supplied it with the resources it would need to become effective. At a U.S. Congress hearing before the Judiciary Subcommittee, representatives from both the Department of Labor, which handled immigration, and the Department of Justice, which handled prohibition, wrangled for control over this new border patrol. Both agreed, however, that this patrol should be responsible for both crimes related to alcohol and Mexican immigrants. Mexican people and crime related to alcohol were now synonymous. Prohibition had morphed them together and would now use tools to fight them. The same walls, the same resources were used to combat one another. Prohibition was building a wall between the two nations. But in 1933, Prohibition was repealed. The failed noble experiment in America was over, and the President of the United States celebrated with a beer. Unfortunately for Mexican immigrants, though, Prohibition was no longer the most important issue in the 1930s. That distinction went to the Great Depression. As unfathomed poverty and unemployment swept through America, Mexicans were no longer useful for their labor. No longer were they needed, no longer were they welcomed. As white Americans lined the streets looking for work, Mexicans became unwelcomed competition. Every job that went to a Mexican meant one less job for a white American. It was not only a new world where Mexicans were unwelcome, it was one they would be systematically eliminated from. Regardless of where they came from or where they were born, to much of America, Mexicans now belonged strictly in Mexico. During the Great Depression, border states began to forcefully deport Mexicans in what would come to be known as the Mexican repatriation. They were sent letters in the mail to leave, rounded up in the streets, forced into buses and onto boats, and shipped to Mexico, regardless of whether they were American citizens or not. Years later, California would officially apologize for its participation. But how could America justify turning its back on the same people it recruited and relied on just a decade before? Prohibition provided that justification. No longer were these people hard workers the country needed. They were now aliens from a land of corruption, a land where American values were openly rejected and criminal activity was legal and supported. Listen to these words. These are all words taken from the campaigns to criminalize alcohol before Prohibition. Needy, indigent, indolent, lethargic, destitute, beggared, weak, reliant, dependent. Now listen to these words. Needy, indigent, indolent, lethargic, destitute, beggared, weak, reliant, dependent. These are all used words to describe Mexican people in the media and politics post-Prohibition. The very same language used against alcohol was now being used against Mexicans. Prohibition may have ended, but the stigmatization and demonization of Mexican people it enabled persisted for years to come. Prohibition provided the justification Americans needed to scapegoat Mexican people in a time where their presence was no longer of value. The wall Prohibition built was now more than just a physical one. Prohibition is a rich and complex era in American history, but it is also perhaps the most transformative period in the history of the U.S.-Mexican border. From labor and immigration to the Mexican drug war, the Prohibition area is rife with lessons that should not go to waste. It is an era in need of much more research and scholarly attention. I would like to thank SURF for giving me the opportunity to do just that. To Leah and everyone involved with SURF, thank you. To my mentor, Professor Osseo-Asare, who just had a baby but still made this possible, thank you. And to Timo, on behalf of all of us surfers, none of this would have been possible without you. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to troubleshoot before the computer for the next session, but I'd like to ask all of the speakers to come up, and we'll just do a few minutes. Come on, please. Good job. And if we could first get some questions for Mary and Michael, if there are any.
Michael, do you have any more research? Are you going to continue on this topic? Or?
Yeah, for today's talk, I focused on one small area. In fact, most of my research did focus on the actual physical material wall, but I felt it was worth bringing up the perception today. But there's plenty more I'd like to do given the opportunity.
Go ahead. Okay, this is a question for Michael. Like you mentioned, you can't help but deny the parallels behind Prohibition and the drug war today. How do you see the demonization of drugs and the whole drug war efforts as also related to immigration reform and demonizing immigrants themselves?
Well, I feel that it's undeniable when you make, like the Border Patrol in existence today, when you make crime related to drugs or alcohol, whatever it may be, and immigrants, one and the same, use the same force to police both, you're making them synonymous. You're not drawing a distinction between the two. And, I mean, that right there shows you that they're it's indistinguishable to many. And there should be some distinction.
My topic? Oh goodness, I don't even, well, I had a class on economic history a long time ago, and we had an essay that basically was, you could write on anything you wanted, and we covered Russia's industrialization efforts. And basically I thought it was interesting how I was saying, like, I wanted to look at the agricultural foundations and the peasants because they actually were the majority of the population, and usually you talk about industrialization and the urban efforts, And I mean, they also talk about like agriculture as well, and that's just something I became interested in and wanted to see if there was a connection between maybe agriculture and the revolution.
Yes.
I have a question
Oh.
for you. Oh, sorry. My question has to do with grain. You said that the US was using grain to finance the industrialization, and indeed reliant on the production of grain to be able to run global food. Do you think that part of the problem for the peasant communities was the increased demand for grain that actually led to this plowing of the fallow and trying to produce more and more cash farmers to stay afloat?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, the famines of, a lot of historians say the famines of 1891 and 1907 were probably caused by the fact that the government was taking the grain away from the peasants. Of course, there's some arguments between that, but that's, yeah, definitely.
Enjoyed very much enjoyed it. I was trying to find out, could you help me with the sources? And it was made one reference to 1900 Russian government survey. Is that where you're getting the information that there was a foul official